All right, I think we're good.
Hey, they can actually see our reflections in there.
So the camera right now is facing the TV. We're going to be, hopefully, you'll be able to see what we're presenting. Sorry we're late. We've been waiting for board members to show up, and we've only got one. So, but we'll go through the Lindsay's presentation here, and then the rest of the board can watch it. And if they have questions before Monday, hopefully, we can get them answered, because Lindsay's going to be on vacation next week. So, all right, Lindsay, take it away. And again, the viewers, you're hopefully able to see the TV.
All right. So for the adoption of the proposed 23 budget, we thought we would do it a little bit differently than we had in the past, and kind of use it as a training session as well as to what all goes into the budget, and kind of get into the procedures and processes that we go through. So the first one is the budgeting overview. It is in state statute that prior to July 1st of each year, budget must be approved for revenue and expenditures of all funds. If there's no budget in place by July 1st, then no funds can be expended, or you're in violation of the state statute. Another piece that I think is important, just because in the world of school finance, the world of a superintendent, there's a lot of acronyms that are used in terms that not everybody hears on a daily basis. So I just have a list of them here. Instead of going through each one individually, does anyone have any questions in regards to any of these acronyms? Some of the ones that are common that we use a lot is like our general education aid, or the general education formula. And that's based upon what we get from the state by our adjusted pupil units. SPED is sometimes used, and that's related to our special education program. OPEB is another one that you don't hear too often, but that's related to being that as a public school district, we have group insurance, which allows individuals to stay on the health insurance after retirement. And because of that, that's taken into consideration in your premium. So we have what we call the other post-employment benefits. UFARS is Uniform Financial Accounting and Reporting Standards. And that's the world that Amy and I live in. We have to code everything based upon that, and our grants and other funding sources need to be accurate because they're derived from that. And then GASB is our Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and that is what I have to follow when I'm prepping for the audit and reviewing the financial statements at year end. So there are different funds within our district budget. They have to balance on their own. They can't cross over to other funds without balancing. And some of the funds that you can have are your general fund, your special revenue funds, and what those are in a school district are your food service and your community service funds. You can have a debt service, so if you have any bonds or related debt out there. Capital projects, so if you have a facilities project or a major project going on, you would use this fund to track all the revenue and expenses related to that. And then the trust fund, so most commonly, and what Bold does have under the trust fund is the scholarships. What these funds are used for, the general fund is where all the activities for educational purposes are recorded in. The food service is, just as it sounds, where you have your National Food Program operation and you are feeding meals to your students. The Community Service Fund is to record all activities related to preschool is a big one, which is also called school readiness sometimes. ECFE, you have your general community ed programs, and then you can also have, this is also where when we have crossing an activity with our non-public schools on the state level, that's where this is recorded as well. The debt service is used to record all revenue and expenditures related to outstanding bond or indebtedness. So the UFAR structure that we talked about earlier is a 17-digit code. So the fund is the first two, and that's going to be your general, your community service, or your food service. What the org or site means is in terms for bold is you have your elementary, your middle school, and your high school. So we have to record expenditures based upon what site the expenditure was derived from. Your program is going to tell you, I kind of like to say this is like a department for easiness of understanding. So you could have a code for FIED, or you could have a code for social studies, or general elementary and general high school. So that just kind of tells you what department you're talking about. Your course is more of an internal thing. It's used to try to put more detail into the general ledger when you want to make things stand out or account for them separately. Or in case of a federal grant, it tells you what year. So if you have a grant that crosses years, you have to use specific course codes to tell the grantor what year you're in. The finance is how it's funded or what source it's going to be taken out of. So for instance, we have restricted dollars for staff development. There's a specific finance code you use for all staff development expenditures. And then the object source. So object means expenditures and source means revenue. And that's going to tell you where it's coming from or where it's going.
So just to clarify, so when we're using this, we get this 17-digit number. And so like, it's going to start with like 02, right? That's general fund?
01.
01, general fund. Then if it's at the high school, it's going to be 020. If it's at the elementary school, it's 035. Middle school 015, I think, or 045.
Elementary 015.
Okay, well, I've got it backwards, but you get the point. So each one of those X's is a number then, and it looks confusing, but when you get used to using it, it makes a lot of sense.
So this is just helpful too for you as board members, because each board packet on a monthly basis, you receive general ledger reports that show you your budget to actual or year-to-date results compared to the budget. So each of those numbers do mean something, because sometimes the description will only give you a little bit of what it is about. And so those other numbers will tell you, when you put them all together, they tell the story. All right, so next I want to just get a little bit into the revenue sources. So when you're reviewing those statements that you get on a monthly basis, makes a little bit more sense. So your 001 through 009 are your local revenues. So that's going to be anything from property taxes all the way to a miscellaneous revenue. So the biggest pieces that are out of that area are your property tax levy dollars. Next would be your grant dollars. So any type of grants that you receive in other than your state or federal sources. And then your miscellaneous revenue. So there's things that come into a school all the time, whether it be a donation or something that doesn't quite fit into the other categories, that would hit your miscellaneous revenues. Your state revenues, the last 3 digits, when you look at the reports, if they're from 200 to 399 in that series, that's going to be our state revenues. Our state revenues can run anywhere from 70 to 75% of our total revenue budget. So a good majority of our accounts are going to be in the state source area. The 400 to 499 are our federal revenues that come directly from MDE. So a lot of these that you would commonly hear as board members are Title I and Title II and Title IV. Those type of federal grants are going to run in that manner. There are a few that come directly from the federal government up until this coming year in 23. Bold has not had any of those, but now we will be getting the REAP grant that comes directly from the federal government. So we will have a grant in that category. The 600 series or 601 to 629 are your local sales, your insurance recoveries if you have any claims and judgments. The 631 to 640 is if you have any sale of bonds or loans. And then when you have transfers from other funds, such as the transfer we make to the community service fund or the pool fund, that is going to be recorded anywhere from 649 to 699. Expenditures, or they're called the object series. So the last 3 digit when you're looking at your expenditure reports, the 100 series is your salary and wages. The 200 series are employee benefits. So we separate our salary and benefits by code. And then the 300s are going to be your purchase services. So that can be anywhere from your contract for transportation. It could be bringing somebody in to do a professional development, contracting with CLA. That's going to go under purchase services. So anytime you have a contract or bringing somebody from an outside vendor in. Supplies and materials, just as it sounds, it's going to be your instructional supplies, your general supplies to run the offices. One other thing that fits in there is food. So in our food service, that group would also include those costs. Capital expenditures are your equipment type purchases. So usually bigger than 5,000 is kind of the general rule because you'll be capitalizing it at that point. If we have debt service payments, they're going to run in the 710 to 790 series. The other expenditures, what really makes up this category for a school district is any licensures or memberships. So any membership to MREA or MASBO or licensures for instance, we have to pay for broiler licenses and stuff like that. They would all hit in those categories. And then other financing uses, that is like on the revenue side, that's the expenditure side of the transfers. So when we start to look at putting a budget together, whether it's a revised budget or adopted budget, there's important things that you should consider. One of them is what your district policies are and guidelines. One of the most important policies when looking at a budget and your fund balance is your fund balance policy, because that is a board approved policy that directs the district where they kind of need to be financially with their fund balance. What our projected enrollment is. Obviously, 70 to 75% of our revenue coming in is based upon our enrollment. So it's important to be looking at that constantly and having a tool to use to project that out. Another thing, especially this year, I'm finding out is what kind of cost increases are you expecting? The economy is changing quite a bit, and their costs are going up. And I mean, it hasn't been just right now, but the last few months. Fuel prices, utilities, even with transportation, that's going to get more expensive when you're paying the fuel bills. So just taking those considerations when you're putting the budget together to make sure that you have enough budget to cover those increased costs. What your facility and equipment needs are. So what going to each department, as Jim has done this last year to make sure we know what is going to come up or if there's going to be, maybe we don't need it this year, but it's a future, or if it breaks, it will have to be replaced if we can't get it in the budget right now. Any staffing changes. And as we know, there's also a shortage of teachers. So there's a lot of staffing changes going around, a lot of movement. So trying to best budget for things like that are going to happen. Also, when you have bargaining or unions, you have to take into consideration if you don't have a settled contract, what that's going to look like, what you think cost increases are going to be, what the market is saying your adjustment needs to be. And obviously the budget is a public document, public information, so it should be as accurate as possible, looking at your assumptions to the best of your knowledge based upon what you're hearing and seeing in resources like from the state. And then what impacts will there be in the future? So again, kind of taking into consideration, where's the economy going? How is that going to affect us? So just here is just for you to see what the current fund balance policy is in place for bold. It's at 40%, or when you convert that into months, it's 4 to 5 months of operating bills. What auditors and state recommendations that you kind of hear out there are 2 to 3 months of operating bills, or 16 to 25% is another way to look at it compared to our current policy. Now, they used to say 1 to 2 months, but even that 2-month category to me is getting with where the prices are, it's getting a little bit to the point where you're probably not as conservative as you need to if something large were to happen, unexpected.
So Lindsay, for somebody that's watching, I know we all get it here, but for somebody that's watching this and maybe doesn't quite understand, can you explain a little bit about how the fund balance policy and what that is?
Yeah, so, well, one is, it's mandated by a GASB or what we have to follow as a school district. But what it is doing is, it's telling a district to set a policy to make sure that they are where they need to be financially. And the fund balance is how you are going to or did end the year. So it's a picture in time of where you are going to end year, where you're like, if you think about a regular business, you have net income or deficit, how that's going to play out to how you're going to end the year and how much, if you will, a savings account to carry into the next year to keep operating. Any other questions on that, or did that answer that well enough?
So just, okay, is this something we would maybe consider changing? I mean, so the end of the bottom is 4 months, right? And so our top would be 3 months. So it's not really that, I mean, it's, I was just thinking, so like if we would go and say, I think we're gonna change our policy to 2 to 3 months. I mean, our bottom right now is 4. I mean, would this be helpful to you?
It would be helpful for us because we're stressed out because we can't follow district policy. There's no way we can have enough fund balance on hand to achieve 40%. So it would help us out, yeah.
And I would say, from a financial standpoint, there's a fine line between working to achieve it and making sure you're going the right direction.
Right.
But again, 40% is probably a little high, especially where, unfortunately, school finance is sitting no matter what district you're looking at. So yes, that policy can definitely be changed and revised. And if you have trouble meeting it year after year, then probably the policy doesn't make sense for you, for the district. So
Right.
I would say it's definitely a possibility or something that should be looked at to analyze and have the board give their opinion on.
Okay.
I would guess the last time we were meeting that was probably 2014, maybe.
Yeah,
It's been a long time.
it's been a while. And part of it too is, and we'll get into this later, looking at the fund balance projections, is there's different categories and part of them affect the unassigned. So that also plays a role. So revising the fund balance policy, if you're going to have assigned and committed funds to incorporate that.
Okay.
All right, so now we're going to kind of get in it after we've taken all those consideration and done the research of what the department's needs and wants are. Now it's time to start putting the budget together. So the first thing that you're going to go to is your enrollment projections, because that is obviously the biggest piece of the budget and very important in looking at the financials. So what tool that I use, and sorry if it's a little small, it's a retention model. It's kind of like how I like to think of it. So basically I have a 10-year history of where our ADMs have been. And you can look at it as a 5-year average or a 10-year average. We usually use a 5-year average. And so I calculate the 5-year average by grade based upon the past history. And then we go over, and what it does is it takes that percentage. So for instance, in your kindergarten class in fiscal year 22 will be moved to first grade. And then you apply that retention percentage to that first grade class. So it's a conservative approach. The only thing with any projection model, no matter how or what method you use, there's still outside factors that can affect the enrollment very quickly. I mean, COVID, for instance, the federal government gave out additional revenue for ADM loss because COVID really did affect a lot of districts as far as their ADM. You've seen a lot of movement to homeschool. You've seen a lot of movement to non-publics where the requirements were a little bit different than what the state required for public schools. So there's still outside factors, the economy, movement in and out of communities for whatever reason. Those still need to be taken into consideration. But I do feel like this is a conservative approach. Unless you have some of those outside factors, it usually works well, and at least to look to the future to see if there's any holes that we need to take into consideration. When you're bringing in, let's say you bring in a small kindergarten class, but in 2 years you're going to graduate a really large senior class. You need to take that into consideration when you look at what you have coming up for expenditures. So then after you have reviewed and get comfortable with your enrollment projection, the MDE puts out what they call a revenue model. Sometimes you hear what if as well. So the what if basically is inserted to this revenue model, and the revenue model takes in other revenue sources as well. So it's a really humongous spreadsheet that you have to work through. So, and again, sorry for the size of this, but this is kind of the first tab that you go to on this revenue model. And basically this has a lot of the formulas and whether it be amount per ADM. So for instance, at the top there, the general education formula is there. So it's $6,863 for 23 because that's already been approved. It went up 2% from fiscal year 22. So we know that's correct. So basically you go through and everything in yellow, you're going to review for accuracy and make sure it makes sense for your district. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to take those enrollment projections you just worked on and you're going to plug in what you came up with that. Then it takes those numbers and does all the calculations and it puts it into a nice revenue summary so that you can place this in the budget. It also, once your levy is approved, the state inserts your levy dollars by the different categories that you bring in, such as your operating capital dollars or levy dollars, your staff development, that type of stuff. They plug that all in. And then you could take this and plug it into the one category that I really look at though, besides letting the formulas calculate this out, is special education. That is calculated so much differently. It's not just taking your ADMs times the formula. There's a lot that goes into what your special education revenue ends up being. So if you have significant fluctuations in your program for 1 year, from 1 year to the next, because it's a leg of 1.5 years to 2 before it's finalized, you really the reports are going to be using old data. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. So let's say, for instance, you had an IEP that moved out of the district that was very costly. You would take that into consideration, knowing that your revenue is going to go down with the expenditures going down. Or you have positions that are hard to fill. So your salary and benefits getting coded to state special ed are going to be down. You kind of have to take that in consideration because this report's not going to get you there. So the next thing then is, well, let me back up a little bit. I should probably explain the other revenues first. So there's other revenues, as I had mentioned. So like for your federal grants, we don't always know the entitlement amounts until the fall. So you kind of look at a 5-year history. What have our entitlements been running at? How are they calculated? And if we're pretty consistent based upon how they're calculated, then you can kind of use that as your guide. But you're always going to, in your revised budget, that's why a revised budget is important. You're always going to have those knowns that you find out later. Your local grants and donations, you have to be conservative on that. You can kind of look at a 5-year history, but those fluctuate so much from 1 year to the next that you just have to be on the conservative end of where you normally bring in local grants or donations. And the same thing with miscellaneous revenue. As far as revenue in the other funds, so food service, for instance, that has been ups and downs the last couple of years because of COVID. So we've been operating under the summer food program where the reimbursement rate is much higher than what we would normally have run under, which is the national food program. So you have to take that into consideration. What program are you going to be operating under, and kind of look at what the claims should be. Now, from year to year, depending on, the meals served are going to increase when all people are free, when all students are free. So now that we're going back to the national food program, as is known right now, and for 23, you have to consider the reimbursement rates are going to be lower, and your number of meals served is probably going to be lower too. So you have to be conservative because you really don't know after how many years of not operating under the National Food Program where your numbers are going to lie. And for the community service fund, a lot of that revenue is either state driven, so you get that from your revenue model, or it is tuition. And so taking a look at where the tuition rates are, where there's increases or decrease, what you think your enrollment's going to be to calculate that out. So then we can move on to the expenditure budget. So the type of expenditures that we've kind of talked about already, but I just kind of wanted to highlight, I took all the funds and listed them out by the major type of expenditures. And then I took our 23 adopted budget that we'll look at in total in a little bit here. And I kind of gave you a percentage of the total budget that it's in. So as I had mentioned, for salary and benefits, you have to look at your contracts that are in place, what are settled, what you have to settle, what the market is saying things are settling at. All that stuff needs to be taken into consideration in your assumptions when you're building your budget. For your contracts, what it's going to look like for utilities. As I said, fuel prices, all that stuff is up compared to what it was 6 to 8 months ago. So you have to take that in consideration. Your transportation, if that contract's up, what that could look like. The supplies and food, even with all these one-time federal grants, that really fluctuate your supplies and stuff like that, depending on how you're going to spend those dollars. So kind of looking at what your plan's going to be, and in the other departments, kind of on average, what their budget has been over the last 5 years. The food budget, that's another place where the prices have gone up extremely. I mean, anybody can see it when you go to the grocery store. Your bill is much higher for not a lot of food. So taking that into consideration, what that's going to look like for a whole fiscal year. Any equipment that's needed, kind of take a look at those department requests and wants and needs and seeing how that fits into the budget. And then each year in July, there's a LTFM plan. You also have your general repairs and maintenance that don't fit under the LTFM plan and what that looks like and what's known at the time of the budget. Now, those are ones that repair and maintenance, obviously, those are things that sometimes you really can't plan for. So you got to do your best on a 5-year average. What are you spending in your repairs and maintenance? And then dues and licenses, unless you're going to get a new program in or have new memberships come about, those are usually pretty stable. So after you've gone through that whole process of budgeting your revenue and expenditures, then you develop them into reports so they can be analyzed and reviewed by myself and administration. So here's what you'll see in your board packet for Monday night's meeting. And this first piece is looking at the funds and their revenue expenditures in total to see how you're coming out. As you can see, there's a couple funds that are deficit spending, and I'll go into some detail about that on the next slide. But the important thing here to look at it is why. If it's because of a one-time purchase or using reserves up for planned expenditures, and you know that this was intention, that's the difference between that and your general operating costs are causing a deficit spend, and you're going to have that from year to year. So I want to go into detail a little bit more about what I mean by that. So the next slide will also be in your packet, but this is the fund balance. So this is telling you how healthy the district is and how you analyze those revenue and expenses that we just saw in the previous slide. Now, there's a couple areas that I want to point out to you as to why it's showing that our revenues are lower than our expenditures in the general fund. So if you look at the operating capital line, you can tell that we're projected to have a $64,000 fund balance at the end of 22. And then we bring in our revenue from state and levy dollars. But we are budgeted by intention because there's things that we need to be replaced, some equipment and other athletic type things that are at the end of the life or are mandated to be replaced. So we are dipping into that reserve that we already have. So as you can see in that category, our revenues are less than our expenditures, which then on the first page that we saw is going to cause your revenues to be lower than your expenditures. So those are one-time purchases that we're putting into operating capital that are causing the expenditures to be higher than revenue, but we have the reserves there
To cover it.
to cover it. So the same thing if you go down to staff development, we have some plan to allocate and utilize some staff development dollars that we do have for professional development days. So by plan, we're spending down more than we're bringing in for the current year because of that. And the same thing with LTFM, just like the adopted budget for 22. If you remember, we had put a roof project in there because we tried to save some LTFM reserve. Even though that was hard to do, we saved it so that we could at least get a roof project done. So that, because we postponed it with everything going on in 22, I put it back into 23. And so we are also spending some of the reserve down in LTFM due to having that larger project budgeted in there. So when you look at those three areas, that accounts for why we're showing the deficit spend of 375 in the general fund. So planned one-time projects or purchases to utilize reserves that we have in place. But the most important thing then is to look at your unassigned. Our unassigned is going up. Not a lot, but it's slightly going up. That is where the discretionary funds are, and that's what you need to look at as a board to make sure that if you do have a deficit spend, that is not affecting that category unless by design. So in this case, it is going up, and it's not in those categories of the deficit spend. It's showing when you solely look at revenue expenses. So that's why it's so important that you can't just look at 1 year. You have to look at the fund balance to make sure that even though the revenue and expenditures show this, what does it look like at the end of the year in your different categories, restricted or unassigned? Anyone have questions on that? I know that's a lot to take in.
When you explained that to me at the beginning of the year, I like how you said that. You said the unassigned fund balance is a great way to measure the health of a district. I like.
I thought you explained it really well.
Yeah.
So this next slide, you've seen before. We've just had a bar graph of the unassigned to kind of show, but what we wanted to add to this, as Jim and I were discussing, what would be good to go over with you board members is there's also other things that affect the unassigned just within your fund balance categories. And so if a board decides to commit funds, which we do have committed funds, which we're going to look at in a little bit here, or in our fund balance policy, it says that the superintendent and or business manager could also assign funds. So if you have those categories, what happens is you take from the unassigned and you place in those because you have specific purposes you want to use those dollars for, or they're already liabilities and that you have to set money aside for them. So I wanted to show you that in total over the last 10 years of what those two look like together. And then the gray line, not the bar graphs, but the gray line adds those two together to kind of show you where we have been when you look at the two together. Because if you just look at the unassigned or the committed and assigned by itself, it doesn't paint the whole financial picture. So we wanted to be able to see that where we were, where we went to, and where we're trying to get back to. The other piece of the packet that you'll have for Monday night is on the fund balance side is your other special revenue funds. So I have the food service here. Food service is another one where we're showing where our revenues are lower than our expenses. That also was by design because, as Jim has mentioned in previous board meetings, that the federal government only allows you to have 3 months of operating expenditures in your fund balance for food service. So unlike other funds, you can only have so much in this. You can't be deficit, but you can only have so much. So there is a lot of expenditures built in here for replacing equipment that's old and outdated or not even working anymore. in our kitchen. So it's a benefit. We have to do it, and it's also a good thing because we're updating kitchen equipment because we're operating under the summer food program has benefited this food service fund balance. So now we can replace some of the equipment that we necessarily couldn't do before. And then the community service fund also has a slight deficit, around 15,000 with the pool mixed in. The one thing that, just to clarify, so if I go back to my budget summary, just so that the pool board can see their budget separately, I have the community service fund and the pool separate here. But for the state, that they don't see that. For the state and for UFAR as a county, that's part of the community service fund. So here, those two funds are together. So that's why it looks, if you were to do the math, it looks a little different than the budget summary, and that's why, just so you're aware of that. And as we kind of talked about, and a lot of districts have this conversation, the preschool program is really important. And until the state decides that there's going to be a funding source for it, and not have it all, try to balance it all by tuition and expenditure reductions, that there's probably going to be some investment on the districts and on the general funds end for the preschool program. So we do have a small deficit spend, but we analyze that when we look at the tuition rates. So the last one is there's been much conversation about those committed fund balances, and really what the original intent was probably got lost with transition of boards and the board and administration. So not knowing the true intent of the projects, and as you can see in the resolution, like you can only use committed funds for the original purpose. So in order to get back to the point where we know exactly what those committed funds are, the finance committee met, we've talked about it at board meetings too, but this is kind of what has come out of those meetings. So here's a resolution that you'll see in your board packet for Monday night, that is taking those dollar amounts that we ended fiscal year 21 with, taking that total amount and kind of allocating it based upon conversations that we've had. Important thing that we heard from the community and the finance committee was looking at the community service fund and paying back the debt on there. So a big chunk of the reallocation is going towards that. We do already have a liability, and it's been part of the committed funds for the Olivia Street assessment. That's a liability on our books. We know what it is. We know that that's our balance, and that's what we have left. So we're putting the dollar amount that we need there. And then the rest of the funds that were sitting out there for the committed funds, we rolled into roof repairs, knowing that the buildings and grounds and Nexus and all that stuff will look at our plan and what we need to do going forward. And we all know that roofs is one of them that we need to look at. So, any questions for me?
No. Very well done.
All right, that's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you
Very much appreciated. I hope we don't have to call you on Monday night and ruin your vacation, but
If you do, I will answer.
I know. Appreciate it. All
If
right.
we can send out the video and the PowerPoint to the rest of the board to make sure that they give a little homework before Monday night. I think
That's a
that
good
would,
idea. Yep.
that would be helpful.
All right. Sounds good.
All right,
We can end our
thank
video.
you.
Thank you.